So I know most of you know Chris, but I thought we'd start with a little bit of a background, how you got into negotiation, being a cop on the beat in Kansas.
Kansas City, yep. Yeah. Well, I joined the FBI, and because my father wanted me to seek bigger and better than just being a local police officer. And he encouraged me to go federal, and he introduced me to a friend of his who was with the Secret Service, and back then it was a federal alphabet. I didn't know the Secret Service from the FBI, from the FDA, any of that. And so the Secret Service guy told me, I've traveled all over the world with the Secret Service. And I remember thinking, I grew up in Iowa. I grew up in a small town in Iowa. And I remember thinking, somebody paid your expenses so you travel all over the world? So at the time, though, the Secret Service wasn't hiring. The FBI was. I joined the FBI. I was FBI SWAT. And then I got transferred to New York and was on the Joint Terrorist Task Force and re-injured my knee. Had reconstructive knee surgery for the second time. And so we had hostage negotiators. They were always there when, SWAT guys were out in the cold and the mud and the rain, and the negotiators are inside talking on the phone. And I thought, well, I could do that. How hard could that be? And I was initially rejected for the negotiation team, but I asked them what I needed to do to get on, and I did it. Which most people don't do. Most people ask advice, don't take it. I did, which impressed them, because most people don't take advice. Who asked for it? There's a big difference whether or not it's solicited and who you solicited it from. And so then I got into hostage negotiation. Not long after I was trained, it was a bank robbery with hostages, which is a really rare thing. Like, it happens on TV all the time. In real life, it doesn't happen at all, almost. Because the bad guys know the police are coming, so they leave. Why hang around? And then I eventually got promoted, put in charge of all of our international kidnappings. More kidnappings all over the world. None here. You don't get kidnappings in nice places. Why kidnap anybody in a nice place? It's only in the bad places.
So now you've moved on from hostage negotiation to speaking to the business community. How are businessmen similar to hostage takers?
They're worse.
They're worse.
Yeah, the crazy thing, of all the things that I've learned about applying hostage negotiation to business, I taught at a couple business schools right after I left the FBI. I taught at Harvard Law School. I taught negotiation there. Hostage negotiations are calmer. Now, give that some thought. But a hostage negotiator from the very beginning starts out thinking, I gotta be easy to talk to. I gotta have a voice that's easy to listen to. If I make people mad, bad things will happen. And very few business people take that attitude. And most business people who succeed in negotiation, and a lot do, they don't succeed because they're good negotiators. They succeeded because they at least learned to stop inflaming the situation. Like there's negotiation conflict is the same thing. Because when you're negotiating, you perceive it as a conflict. Somebody's going to take something from you. It's conflict. And there's 3 conflict types: fight, flight, and make friends. Overtly aggressive. The flight type is overtly thoughtful and very calm, almost sometimes to the point of being detached. The make friends type are as exactly as described. Focus on relationships. They're the kind of people that say time isn't money, relationships are money. Those are the relationship-focused people. At the top level, and I was just at a conference of a membership group that I'm part of, that it costs $100,000 a year to be in the room. And across the board, there were no overtly aggressive types. None. They were either extremely calm or they were, and that was 80% of them. Just calm, don't inflame it. And then the other 20% were very, very, very relationship or focused. Now, a third of the world splits evenly into thirds. Fight, flight, make friends. I get reason for saying this. Doesn't matter your gender, your ethnicity, your geography. I got more than enough data to back that up. In China, who they're supposed to be the stereotype of the Chinese, super quiet, all the stereotypes, taught Chinese executives from the Chinese Development Bank. All three types, fight, flight, make friends, doesn't matter. But if you learn the fight is bad. To be aggressive is always counterproductive. And if you're at the top of your game, you got there because you learned. So if you're natural born aggressive, I am a natural born aggressive. Eventually we get tired of hitting our head against a brick wall. And sometimes we're a little slower than everybody else is, but we catch on.
I want to ask, how is negotiation different from influencing, persuasion, lobbying, or even just straight up salesmanship?
Most of that is in the eye of the beholder. You know, what's the difference between influence and manipulation? What you're trying to do to the other side. Are you trying to succeed with them, or are you trying to succeed against them? If you're trying to take advantage of them, it's manipulation. If you're trying to succeed with them, then you get much more into influence, collaboration, long-term mutual benefit, long-term relationship of trust, which then pretty much encompasses whatever you're talking about.
You say the most dangerous type of negotiation is the negotiation you don't know you're in.
Right.
And I mean, everything in life is a negotiation to an extent. But most of these negotiations are not adversarial. And it is about finding mutual benefit, long-term gain.
Right.
And I want to start by talking about the everyday negotiations we have in the workplace with
Right.
colleagues. For instance, who gets to take credit, who takes on responsibility,
Right,
who
right.
gets blamed. These, I want to hear your thoughts about some tactics on how you establish good relationships and ongoing negotiations in such an environment.
Yeah, sure. So the commodity that's at stake in every negotiation, every single negotiation, is time. Most people think they're in a negotiation when you're talking about money. By the time you get to money, you've been talking about time for a long time. You've been in a negotiation for a long time. So as soon as you're talking about collaboration, you're in a negotiation. And all the things that you described are about time. Who does what? Who gets credit? Who gets blamed? It's about people's investment in time and whether or not they're going to live up to what they say. So, and it's crazy how hard it is sometimes for people, because it seems counterproductive. If I hear you out completely, the chances that you're going to give me everything I want are really high. Just because I heard you out. Like that doesn't make any sense. But what happens if I hear you completely out? If I hear you completely out, when you feel heard, how important is that? Think about how you feel when you don't feel heard. Think about how you feel when every word you said has been ignored or disregarded. How does that infuriate you to have been ignored or disregarded? It's equally positive on the flip side. We learned that in hostage negotiation. The neuroscience that backs it up now. If you feel completely heard, here's what happens to you. And this happens to you because you're a human being, not because of your gender, your ethnicity, any of that, your religion. It's just because you're human. We're all born a blank slate. We're all born human, period. What you are after that is layered on top of it. If you feel completely heard and completely understood, you get a hit of the neurochemical oxytocin. You guys know what oxytocin is? The bonding drug. if I hear you out, you feel bonded to me. So that's the beginning of a great collaboration. Secondly, I get 2 more points. And oxytocin makes people tell the truth. I'm a big fan of this guy, Andrew Huberman. Huberman's Huberman Lab podcast. If you're into human performance, if you want to be a better human being, some of the most reliable information on just being a better human being. Doesn't matter what it is. I'm listening to his podcast about relationships. He talks about oxytocin, and he says people tell the truth when they get oxytocin. So you're bonded to me and you tell the truth. Now the third thing that you get when you feel heard, completely heard, serotonin. Serotonin is a drug of satisfaction, which means you want less. You're less greedy when you get serotonin. You're more satisfied with what you have. So you feel bonded to me, you're going to be honest with me, and you've lost your greed at the table. Just by making you feel heard.
The outset of the negotiation is very important, and your bargaining power is also your reputation.
I'm going to find out what's important to you. I mean, really, another friend of mine is getting ready to put out a book that's called What's in It for Them?
Yeah.
Like, if I find out what's in it for you, there may be something in it for you that I didn't even think of that I could do. So that's the other part of hearing somebody out. Like, what's in it for you? Why talk to me? If you call my company on the phone, we're going to say, why are you calling us? I mean, really, what do you want to get out of doing business with us? And we'll try to help you get there. And so that whatever we charge you, and we're going to charge you a lot, but you're going to get more out of it than you paid for. Every time.
So I want to hear your thoughts on negotiation in a larger context. I mean, the ultimate negotiation is war. And I think, in recent history, it's been very difficult to see what winning looks like. And not to get political, but if you look at Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam.
Something went bad in Afghanistan? Really?
I
Did
don't
the Americans
know.
screw that up again?
Some people made a lot of money, though. So maybe that was the winning part.
Yeah.
But when you look at these contexts, not only is it difficult to know what winning looks like, you don't even know who you're negotiating against or what the motivations are. And I think I've been hearing about police doing work with criminal gangs. And there are these gang wars. The police can't even figure out what they're fighting over. And when they try to interview these gang members, they can't even explain it themselves.
Right.
And how do you negotiate in such a position? I mean, how do you find common ground? How do you move on from there?
Common ground is always going to be based on the future. Like, what do we see in the future? Is there a spot in the future that we can both pick out that we both like? And can we move then back to this point? And an attorney that I had a tremendous amount of respect for in Los Angeles, every time somebody got into an argument with him, he'd say, you know what I want? I want us to be able to look back on this moment 10 years from now and think that all the good stuff we did together started right here. Pick a spot in the future that we can work back from. And so I think wars in general are, nobody's thinking about where we're trying to be here or what the aftermath is going to be. Certainly, any country that spends a lot of money on its military loves to spend money on the military, and I don't know how many times we got to do it in the United States when we're left with a mess. If we'd have put it in economic development, we'd have spent less money. But that's the way it is, and nothing I say is going to change that. But what's the point in the future that we can pick out? If we use the bank robbery model, negotiations, as a model constantly in my company for an intense negotiation. Because when is somebody trying to get something out of you, either you can't or shouldn't give them. Whether it's an employee that wants a raise, whether it's a customer that wants a discount or they walk to a competitor. I mean, that stuff comes up all the time. So we call it 60 seconds or she dies. And I would be bank robber, and one of you would be the hostage negotiator, or the other way around. The bank robber says, I need a car in 60 seconds or she dies. But the best answer to that is, sounds like you want to live. Because there's a point in the future that we can both agree on. Now let's work our way back.
How is hostage negotiation relevant to that kind of negotiation in business where you are looking for the long term?
Well, yeah, and we were talking about this earlier. I mean, hostage negotiators, we got repeat customers. There was a siege in Baltimore, biggest manhunt in the history of the city of Baltimore. They finally get the bad guy cornered. Negotiators, Baltimore County Police Department, they're a little bit excited because of this 10-day siege. The guy was wanted for 4 murders. And they were excited on the phone with him, and he said, you're not doing a good job. You're supposed to be establishing rapport with me. He'd taken hostages previously. Negotiators can't lie. We can't deceive. We can't threaten, because we're going to see these guys again. And we do. We see them again over and over and over again. So we always talk to everybody as if we're going to deal with them again, because if we're not, one of our colleagues is. And so we believe in long-term relationships. Reputational. We got a reputation.
Exactly. I mean, going back to war, I mean, in the Second World War, armchair historians like to talk about how it could have turned out differently, but the most famous negotiations with Ribbentrop Pact and, I mean, with when that was broken, it was impossible for Germany to negotiate when they had screwed everybody over so many times.
Yeah, what alternatives are you left, right? In a business world, then you got to sue everybody.
Yeah, you were mentioning...
Or you got to pay cash up front for everything. And how long can you do that?
You talk about mirroring in your book. And how do you practice these techniques? I think everyone's familiar with mirroring, both in body language and also in verbally. But it's pretty obvious sometimes when people try to do it. How do you practice and become good at it?
How do you become good at it?
Yeah.
It literally is practice. Mirroring especially. Mirroring is not the body language mirroring, just repeating a couple of words of what the person just said. I can't explain why, but I see on a regular basis people that are both high IQ and high EQ love mirroring. The people that just love it. You know, I don't know, because it's so simple and elegant and like no energy. Like to mirror just doesn't require a tremendous amount of elaborative, complicated thought. You just mirror. And the people that I see that are just in love with it, and that might be the only thing they ever do. And it's hard to ask somebody, you know, do you have a high IQ? How are you going to say no to that, right? No, I don't, as a matter of fact. But high IQ, high EQ people love to mirror. And they do it so gently, and they keep conversations. There was a hospital executive. He was the number 3 guy at a hospital conglomerate, monstrous organization. He loved mirroring so much that before he pulled his team together into a room, he'd say, you know, when we go in here, the only thing I'm going to do is mirror. Nothing else, nothing. Just going to repeat a couple of words. Inside of 15 minutes, we're going to know whether or not we can make the deal. And they're not going to have any idea that's what I'm doing. And the deal will either come to us or it won't. And if it doesn't, we're going to get up and leave. So the mirroring is just like ridiculously effective if you get comfortable with it. And
so what do you do when you see that you're being mirrored and the tactic is being used?
To me, it's where the person is coming from. Like we get this stuff used on us all the time. We use this in our company with each other because we trust each other. We collaborate with each other. And if I suspect somebody's trying to exploit me, we exit the negotiation very quickly. Like it's not a sin to not get the deal. It's a sin to take a long time not to get the deal. It's also a sin to take a long time to get a bad deal. Because if it's a bad deal, you're working for half your compensation, at best. A bad client costs you anywhere from 2 to 5 times the amount of time a good client does. So if it only costs you twice as much as a good client, that means you just took a 50% cut in pay at a bare minimum. And so we don't have room for bad clients in my business. And so we'll figure it out really quickly. And if somebody only wants to mirror me, like if you mirror me, I'll answer. But at some point in time, you're not willing to share with me, then I'll cut the conversation off politely. And I'll say something to the effect of, happy to talk when you're ready to make a mutual commitment.
I mean, these techniques, to me, oftentimes they're just deflecting from what's at hand and being negotiated. And if the intention is to get liked by the other person or to get into reach an understanding and trust, I mean, it comes down to personality to a great extent. I mean, going back to like the full context of who it is you are with your reputation and also body language, when you have a very aggressive, big man, there is still, the dynamic is very different. But there are many other dynamics that are also very different. You've got the same background, same social class, education, or there's a sexual attraction between two people. There are power balances.
You find me attractive?
Strangely so.
Notice he put the emphasis on strangely.
My point is that oftentimes the outset of negotiation, who you're bringing in to negotiate at the table, is half the battle is won than by having the right match.
Well, and he brings up a really interesting point, because we've always struggled with this, and you talked about common background, common whatever. And as a hostage negotiator, I got to talk to somebody that I got no common ground with. Like, right, how am I going to have some common ground with a guy from Al Qaeda? Did you play baseball growing up? Hey, I'm from Iowa. What'd your dad do for a living? How are you going to have common ground? But ask yourself this. When you're looking to negotiate with somebody that has common ground with you, why do you want them to have common ground? I would offer the answer is that you want them to understand you. You want them to understand where you're coming from. You want them to share the same core values you have. So that common ground ideally just shortcuts that. But I couldn't have more common ground with anybody on this planet other than my sisters. Same ethnicity, same economic environment, same religion, same household. Pick same, right? We don't agree on anything. And you get siblings like that in your family too, right? But what you're looking for from common ground is, does this person understand where I'm coming from? I want to deal with somebody who understands me, which gets me back to the original point. What are we dying for from common ground? Because you and I share the same values. You and I want the same things. I don't have to guess whether or not you believe in these things. And you want to know where I'm coming from. And you want me to know where you're coming from. And so genuinely understanding someone really becomes, the upgrade from common ground. What are we looking for from common ground but real understanding of who we are as human beings? Establish trust quickly. Get rid of the word trust, become predictable. Now, here's where that falls down for almost everybody. If you're in a collaborative relationship, you're trying to get something done with anybody, when do you reach out for them? When you have good news, when you have bad news? When are you going to have good news or bad news? You don't know. Therefore, you're unpredictable. If you establish any project, if someone always knows when they're going to hear from you, even if you say, hey, listen, nothing new, the other person feels very reassured you're completely predictable. You automatically build trust. You need to call somebody on the phone. I did this the other day. We had a documentary film coming out. It's premiering in Beverly Hills, September 26th. We screened it in Las Vegas about 3 weeks ago. We screened it And 4 days after the screening, I realized an extremely significant change had to be made in the film. And I realized this on a Sunday. And I sent the documentary film producer, Nick Natton, DNA Films, 22 Emmys, wonderful human being. 2-line text. Is now a bad time to talk? Not do you have a few minutes? And I got really bad news. Now, how long did it take him to reach out for me? And what was he mentally prepared for at the time? He called me within 3 minutes, and he didn't know what the hell the bad news is. Maybe I've been indicted. Maybe I was in a video. Everything horrible goes through his head. And he's like, all right, let's bring it. All right, I'm ready. I don't know what it is. He called. I go, we got to make changes in the film. This is what we got to do. This is how we got to do it. He goes, okay. Now, this normally would have been a conversation that might have taken two weeks, but we already got a premiere scheduled in Beverly Hills. We don't have time to talk about this. We got to get to an answer and a plan and implementation in 15 minutes or less. And it's all on him because he's put up all the money. Human beings are insanely resilient if you warn them the bad news is coming. And most of the time, you don't. Most of the time, you go like, hey, how are you? Hey, how are you? You know what every boss says before they fire somebody? Like, I'm not kidding. Hey, how are you? And somebody's getting ready to get fired. How many people are actually caught off guard when they get fired? They know it's coming. Another friend of mine, Ned Colletti, used to be the manager of Los Angeles Dodgers. When he had his first job in baseball, Chicago Cubs, he worked for the Cubs. They fired him because he was right about a free agent signing that they messed up, and the people above him resented the fact that he was right and they were wrong, so they decided to fire him. He starts hearing he's going to get fired 4 or 5 days in advance. He starts checking all his friends. They're like, how can he fire you? You're doing a great job. And on top of that, you were right and they were wrong. And then all his friends came back to him and said, hey, yeah, you know what? When you go to that meeting on Friday, they're going to fire you. Guess what his boss said to him when he sat down? Hey, how are you?
But I guess
that's catching people off guard with bad news. I mean, just don't do it. You'll be shocked at how much more people like talking to you if you never, never, never let anybody get caught off guard by bad news, ever.
So tell me about the documentary. Was that the tactical empathy that was being reworked?
Yeah. It just, there were a couple pieces that needed to be fixed.
And what's tactical empathy?
Well, like, what's the documentary? What's the term? What's the definition?
Yeah.
Yeah? I gave him 3 choices, and he said yes.
All of them. Take your choice.
All right, so tactical empathy is our term for the calibrated application of emotional intelligence. And what's it calibrated by? Calibrated people smarts, calibrated by neuroscience. What's neuroscience tell us? Neuroscience tells us that people are in normal survival mode are basically 75% negative. Number one. Neuroscience also tells us that the best way to deactivate negativity is to simply call it out. I can get ready to engage in something with you, and I may say, look, I don't want to seem like I'm being disrespectful. What's your first thought? This is going to be disrespectful.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But if I say instead, this is probably going to sound disrespectful. Now you're prepped. I'm not catching you off guard. If I got bad news, I say I got bad news. When I was doing a talk a couple years ago, somebody asked a question. There's almost always something smart in a question, no matter how it's worded. And this was the one time this guy asked me a question that was the dumbest thing I ever heard in my life. And I thought about it. I thought, like, how can I bail this guy out? I don't know how to bail him out. I don't want to answer this question and embarrass him in front of everybody. Because embarrassment is the worst emotional pain there is. People would rather die than be embarrassed. That's how much a bad embarrassment is. So I just looked at him and I said, this is going to sound harsh. I let it sink in. And I waited about 3 seconds. And then I answered the question. And he went, okay. And he sat down, and somebody else started to ask a question, and he went, that wasn't harsh.
So how do you diffuse emotions in negotiations? Are you saying that businessmen are more emotional than terrorists?
So let's draw a distinction on emotions. Because if somebody says to you, you're being emotional, they're talking about a negative emotion, right? In business, whenever people are talking about emotions, 99% of the time, it's a form of anger in some way. It's a negative emotion. If you're hopeful and positive about an outcome, you really want to collaborate, you're fun to be around, the people look at you and go, you're being emotional. No, they like you. So it's negative emotions. So you just call them out. Now, how stupid does that sound? This neuroscience experiment has been reproduced several times. They put the functional magnetic resonance imaging device on people's heads, which tracks the electrical activity in your brain. And then they showed people photographs that induced negative emotions. I don't know what the pictures were. They could have been puppies in the rain. They could have been a homeless person. They could have been the politician you hate the most winning an election. I don't know what it was. But they watch the areas of the brain associated with negativity light up. And with everybody, it's a little bit different, but you got a cause and effect thing here, so you know what's going on. And then he simply said to him, what are you feeling? Simply call the negative emotion out. Just call it out. And every time, not some of the time, every time the negativity was called out, the electrical activity diminished. Now, the amount that it diminishes changes. Like it might be a little, it might be a lot. But this has been duplicated several times. Just calling out the negative emotion is the single most effective way to get somebody's negativity turned down. And then afterwards, then the positivity can gain. And if you guys look at your business relationships, the people that you really trust, if you were to go back through it, by and large, if you could go over the chronology, you would find that you were around them long enough that your fears got deactivated. And then you were free to believe in them after your negativity went away. Second case I worked in the Philippines, Burnham Sabero kidnapping, Al-Qaeda-related group, the Abu Sayyaf. That case was a train wreck from the beginning to the end. And people got killed, and bad guys were double-crossing. And I land in Manila at the airport at 10 o'clock at night. And the minute my plane touches down, I get a call saying, they want you in the South, which is, the red zone, if you will, to use a term from Baghdad. They want you in the red zone. The terrorists, the kidnappers are holed up in a hospital. They got the hospital surrounded. They were in the midst of a firefight. And there's nothing about that sounds right. And we used to say you can't negotiate a riot or a gunfight. I'm like, during gunfire, they're going to have trouble hearing me. So I fly down there, and the first briefing we get, and I've got a female negotiator with me, it's her first overseas kidnapping. Our very first briefing is how to escape if our position is overrun by the terrorists. And I remember feeling this glare in the side of my head. And I could see her staring at me. And I'm like, this isn't usually the way it is. So we're expecting a firefight. The negotiator that I coached in a previous negotiation was a commander of the SAF, Special Action Force. The police is Navy SEALs. And these guys were killers. They were good. And he was a great leader and a very dangerous man. And he said, I'm going to go be with my guys because I don't think everybody's going to live. So we go to bed that night. I am expecting to wake up in the middle of the night being told that half the hostages are dead. Everything's going bad. I go to bed. Nobody wakes me up. I wake up, the sunlight wakes me up the next morning. And I don't hear anybody in the compound that we're in. And I start walking around and they're all gone. Like nobody's there. It was as if I wasn't even on the same planet that I'd been the night before. In the middle of the night, somebody called away the soldiers that had the rear perimeter. Somebody called them away for a briefing. There was no replacement. And coincidentally, the terrorists walked out of the back of the hospital with the hostages and walked down the street when magically the rear perimeter was gone. And we got out of bed in the morning and they were gone. And Gracia Burnham, who's the only American that lived, in her book, In the Presence of My Enemies, she talks about that when they walked out of the hospital, they thought there was going to be this massive gunfight and there were going to be bullets flying everywhere. And they walked out and nobody was there. And they walked down the street and they were shocked. Like their brains couldn't compute the fact that they'd been surrounded by the military and suddenly the military was just gone, magically. And that was how the case started. So that thing went bad for 13 months. But we learned a lot from it. We learned how it went bad. We learned what we had to take into account, and we got better as a result. The first impression is the second most important impression. The last impression is the most important impression. Last impression should always be positive, should always be optimistic. Typically, what you would say at the very beginning should at least be repeated word for word at the end, so that you control the last impression. Now, my company's policy on deal making is there are people out there that we call HAF, hard, annoying, lame, and frustrated. And we don't do business with HAFs, but we always give HAFs the opportunity to become easy, lucrative, and fun. And so, if we don't make a deal with you, there will be no doubt in your mind what a great deal looks like to us. And we will lay out, here's what we would like to have from you so that we have a long-term relationship where everybody makes money. If I'm worried, it's my amygdala. And my amygdala is negative, and it is not my friend. It's a very good psychologist friend of mine. We were talking about this a couple years ago. He thinks the amygdala is the single thing that's holding humanity back more than anything else. And I just say, I literally say to myself, listen to your gut. What's your gut tell you? You know, your gut's pretty good. Your amygdala is paranoid, 75% negative. Your gut is based on the information from a supercomputer between your ears. Your conscious mind processes roughly 40 bits of information per second, whatever a bit is. My source is a biology of belief. I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head, but it's a great book on mental functioning. Conscious mind, 40 bits of information per second. Subconscious mind, 20 million. It's a 500,000 to 1 ratio in computing power of the supercomputer that feeds your gut instinct. So what I often, if I find myself concerned, I will repeat the mantra. I will repeat to yourself, what's your gut? What's your gut? Listen to your gut, because I'm trying to deactivate the amygdala. That's the one I'm doing these days. If I'm upset, I also know, if you've read the book, if you've listened to the masterclass, you're familiar with the late night FM DJ voice. Well, that voice calms me down too. I'll kick that voice into gear when I'm trying to keep my anger under control. And then one of the last ones, probably the most intellectually sound, but could be the most difficult. Nobody wants something out of me unless I'm successful to begin with. There isn't a single negotiation I'm in that I'm actually not lucky to be in. And if it's the gratitude, whatever gratitude. If you're doing gratitude, You should, just to make yourself more effective. You kick gratitude into gear. Gratitude or curiosity, it's impossible to be afraid and grateful. It's impossible to be afraid and curious. Now, whether or not you can flip that switch is not always that easy, but I know that to be the case. So those are kind of the ways I try to deactivate my fears.